Roby and welcome to my workshop.
Well, last episode we were building a 3D cutting board. It's a wedding gift for a new bride and groom. I think they'll really like it. We did make some progress. We got all of our lumber milled up and assembled into what I call a log. Now that log has a 3D pattern running across its length, and we'll take that and cut it into pucks. Those pucks are then assembled into our cutting board. Now we got to move on with this. I'm starting to hear wedding bells ring, and we got to get that board to the church on time. So come on out in the shop. Let me show you what we got going on. If you think that cutting board's going to assemble itself, you're wrong. We need a jig for that, and the foundation of that jig is going to be a torsion box. Let me round up a few things. I'll meet you over at the table saw.
Kitchen stuff. 3D cutting board, part 2.
All our half laps are good. They're pretty tight as well. I'm very pleased with this. This is the beginning stage of a torsion box. Torsion box is dead flat and extremely stiff for the weight ratio. And I've got a lot of stiffness here with this 3/4 inch ply. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna mark in these areas right here. This is gonna help me do a number of pilot holes. And I will drill out the pilot holes, turn this over, and then countersink them into all of these struts right here. After that's done, we apply some glue. And then we do it all over again because we need a skin on this side as well, not as thick. This is going to produce a flat foundation that is extremely stiff for our jig.
Having marked the top of the plywood, I will go ahead and drill out and countersink holes for the screws. Now that those have been drilled out, I'll reassemble the top with the torsion box verticals and drill holes for the screws inside the vertical slats. Now that those have been drilled out, I'll put the top back on and drill the same holes into the surround and the torsion box web members. This is important as a screw can split the plywood pretty easily, and I'm not working with the best stuff. Now nails would have worked, but nails can loosen, and I want the positive grip power of a screw. I also don't want to wait on the glue to dry, so this is the most expedient way to get this process done. With all the prep done for the top and the torsion box interior, it's time to go ahead and put it together. Now I want to make special note of those half laps. Those are done on the table saw, and I did take some time to get the thickness of the dado blade assembly just right. The height is higher than half the thickness of the web members. As you might imagine, if it wasn't, you wouldn't get a good clean fit. You'd have some that were higher than others, and we don't want that. Location is important. You have to have these things lined up exactly right. And as a matter of fact, in some cases, I've done these with all the boards ganged together. If you're off by a little bit, it won't fit together very well. And if you're right on target, it's still difficult to assemble. Well, this is looking a little like a catastrophe, but it did finally assemble well. Let's move on to the next scene. This is embarrassing. Now let me say a few words here. We are putting the top back on, and I have 4 corner screws drilled through. I know the top is square, but I also know the torsion box is not square. Well, it may be close if I was lucky, but the top is going to square it all up. So we need to make sure that we tap these screws back into the original holes we drilled when it was pre-assembled. After my 4 corner screws are in place, I'm set to go. We'll just go ahead and put screws into the rest of the members, and then we'll look at the bottom. For this application, the bottom only really needs to be 1/4 inch plywood. So while we do need a lot of glue, I think nails are sufficient. We'll go ahead and put a bead down, then place our plywood on top. Once we get it lined out right, we'll put some 1-inch brads in each corner and then go ahead and tack off the web members accordingly. There'll be a lot of nails put in here. Don't skimp. I've chosen Formica as my non-stick surface for my jig. I will use a simple rubber cement as the adhesive. I go ahead and apply a liberal amount in the middle, and then I take a scrap piece of wood, and you could use a credit card, but you take a scrap piece of wood and you start to rub it into the surface. Now it's easy to see if you've been there. It changes color, both on the Formica and on the plywood. Spread it out thinly but completely. You want every surface that is going to stick to have some glue on it, but you do not want any large accumulations to be left. It all has to be spread out thin, no exceptions. Anything that's left over and not smoothed out will actually cause a bump in the Formica surface. When the two surfaces are tacky to the touch, they're ready to be glued up. Now, I put slats down. Those slats are important. They help me line up the two surfaces, so when I pull the slats out, I know I'm in the right place. Those slats don't have any glue on them, so they're not going to stick to either side. Once I'm lined out, I'll go ahead and put a little pressure on the middle. This makes sure that my piece doesn't move. I'll take out two of the slats and then use a J-roller to start to press the surfaces together. This is going to start the glue up process. Now I'll leave those other two slats in place. The thought process here is the longer they remain in place, the fewer bubbles I'm going to build into the surface. We'll take them out, and at this point we start working on the edge. Start from the middle and work out. You're trying to push out all the air in between the two sides. That'll give you good adherence, and it'll give you fewer bubbles between the two surfaces.
Well, I have myself laid out here to build what I call my compression square. This will sit on top of the torsion box. There are a lot of things to do to make this come together. The first thing we've got to do is get these boards on top milled up so I truly understand that they're both square and straight.
The milling process will start at the jointer, and that's where we get one side perfectly flat. Then we go to the planer and make both sides parallel. With my compression ring all squared up, I'm marking the spots where I'm going to drill out holes for the compression screws. We're going to be using T-nuts to get our compression. For an application like this, I like to drill out for both the base and the shaft of the T-nut. After the profile for the T-nut has been drilled out, we'll go ahead and drill out the hole for the compression screw. Keep in mind, the Formica has a thickness and it extends under our boards. We'll put a rabbet in to accommodate for that. I have applied Formica to the two sides that the cutting board is going to bump up against once in the compression ring. Now that Formica has a sharp edge. Take yourself a file and file it down so you don't have a sharp edge that could cut you when you're trying to assemble your cutting board.
Well, if you want to put something back where you have it, drill a couple of holes all the way through to the other side. That way you can drop a screw through and find the hole when you glue it up, and it'll index it for you. Now this side over here, I am indexed already. I'm finger tight. Once this was in place, it's all over. I have a square here that'll get me tight. So let's go ahead and start spreading some glue from here to get this first piece put in place.
One bit of caution here, if you do what I recommend and drill out these things in advance, don't put glue over the hole. You just can't see it as well, and it makes everything a little bit more difficult. Now that we found our holes, it's just a matter of driving the screws home. Once the first two screws are in place, we'll start working on the rest of them. There's about a screw every inch to get this compression ring totally secure against the base. This is probably the most critical connection in the project. It has to be square. These two sides must be square with each other because we're going to be compressing all of our pucks against this corner. If we're not at 90 degrees, the cutting board never will be. I'll take one of my clamping squares and make sure it's secure and the joint is tight. I won't put a screw in this piece until I know it's square. Once I'm satisfied it's tight, that's when I'll put the screws in. I won't even pre-drill. I want as little movement as possible until the first screw is in. And then I'll put the remaining screws in going toward the joint.
Well, we are about 3 shy from having a complete set. I don't think that's going to be a big deal because my cutting board isn't going to be any bigger than this. So the cawls will push it up past this, and I don't even think I'll utilize all these. So we're in good shape. Now, with this complete, we need to go back to the logs and start making some pucks. And I have my log set up over here, and I have an auxiliary fence on my fence with a stop right here that will allow me to cut at exactly 1.5 inches. Now, we could do this on the compound miter saw. This is a better blade. It cuts cleaner. Additionally, I've got a zero clearance right here, so I get wonderful shear on the other side. All this is about preserving material. So let's go ahead and cut these up, then we'll put them in our assembly jig and see what we've got. Well, this jig is new to me, so I wanted to try it out with a sample, and that's unusual to me too. Usually I just jump right in, but I wanted to do a sample here, and these are the end. This is the drop from all our pucks. None of these are 1.5 inches thick. They're all smaller. And a lot of these have defects in them. And one of the things that we're going to be testing out is to see how we can get the glue sandpaper mix to fill in some of these gaps. So this is an important test. Now I've got my cawls here with my boards here to take the brunt of the screws. I envision steel back here eventually. And I've got cawls right here. We're going to take these out. I'm going to put packing tape here and let that be my nonstick surface. So we'll glue these up and we're going to pull this out of the jig. I am very much interested to see how this comes out. And you'll note I've got some holes back here. That's new. I put those holes in because I might have to shove something up underneath to get this to lift out. Formica's pretty non-stick. We're about to find out how non-stick it is.
I'll give you the catbird seat for this assembly, so kick back and enjoy the ride.
Well, same as last time. Part of the setup here is making sure everything is in the right place. And I've actually arranged my entire field right here in the right place. And we'll move all these over. This is the corner we press against. I got my cawls over here. I've got my glue here with my brush. I think I'm ready to go. So we're going to start gluing this up and moving it from this corner to that corner. One last thing, when you arrange your pieces here, triple check them. It is so easy to get one of these off. Also note, I need to paint both sides of this. I only need to paint one side of this. I don't need to paint this one at all. So keep that in mind when you're painting these with glue. You do want a good coat, but you don't have to overdo it. Final thought, this Titebond 3 is waterproof at the end of the day, which is good for a cutting board. It also has a longer set time, which we will need.
The assembly sequence for the sample board is representative of all cutting boards made on this jig, so I see no reason to repeat that here.
Well, the piece came out pretty good. I am not unhappy with it, but I can't say I'm happy either. First of all, getting it out of this jig took a little bit more force than I wanted to. We actually put a sizable dent in the back of this one, and that defines the back now. So we're going to have to make a bigger hole in here, get more surface area where we can apply the kind of pressure to pop this thing out without causing damage. Additionally, We did not put the edges on this, and I wish I had, because when I take my little 3x4 piece right here and I put the edges on this one, I cut this one because it was a little uneven, and I cut it a little too short, and that's a problem, because as it is, it doesn't look quite right. We will probably end up trimming this back and making it a 3x3 instead of a 4x4, and that's a real shame, but it is what it is. This was a test piece anyway. Finally, one more thing happened here that I wasn't expecting. I thought that I would get pretty good pressure down, because I'm actually on these pressure points, I'm actually higher than center, so I had expected everything to come down in the middle, and it didn't. It bowed up a little bit. So we are going to apply pressure from the top, and I've got a few pieces to do that as well. We're getting ready to glue up, and we're getting ready to put everything into place here. Again, we'll do some highlights as we go forward, but to be truthful with you, it's going to be a lot more of the same. Let me get some glue set up in my brush, and we'll get started.
Like all processes, this has a beginning, and it starts with the first block. We'll paint both sides and put it in the jig. But unlike previous boards, it doesn't end with the last block. We're going to go ahead and put the side pieces in this time. Now remember, that last block, it doesn't need any glue. Everything's already been pre-painted. My side pieces are already cut, so I will go ahead and apply some glue to those and put those in place. Once all my cauls were in place, I checked it for level, and it turns out that I'm pretty flat here. I don't see a reason for having the pieces on top to hold it flat. I'm not too sure what happened with the last one, but this one looks really level. A couple of taps on the high spot's really all I need. I'm happy with the assembly, and it's time to apply a little pressure. That is very quickly done with a hand drill. The drill does a good job, but I'll tell you now, you really don't know how much pressure you've got on each one of those screws until you follow up with a screwdriver. Let your hands tell you when they're tight. Well, we're about done, and we'll give it one more look over. Everything's tight, and it's square. But we've got one more thing to do, and it's really tough. We've got to leave it alone.
Well, it is time. I'm getting ready to pop this one out. And of course, the first thing to do, take the pressure off.
Backing out all these screws is a somewhat lengthy process, so we'll jump to the end on this. The removal method is not what I had originally envisioned, but what I had envisioned didn't work. I have a 5/8 socket with an extender that can go all the way through the jig. The extender is in contact with the table, and the socket is in contact with the cutting board. I was surprised at how little pressure it took to get the cutting board to let go.
That worked pretty well. That worked really well.
Well, I think we'll be using packing tape from now on. It seems like it doesn't stick nearly as much as the Formica.
Well, we are sanded down to 100 grit, and this looks great. It is level. I like the way the drum sander does a number on these. Now, you can use a router and a couple of rails, and you can get there with a big leveling bit. That's fine. I like the drum sander better. I take off less material that way, so I end up with a thicker board. And I find that getting it all the router marks out of the piece is quicker using a drum sander than it is with a router. So that doesn't alleviate us from having to do some hand sanding here. I've got my random orbital sander right there, and we're gonna start at 100 grit, and we're gonna take it all the way up to 400. At 220, we're gonna make a stop. We may want to look at this and see if we have any repairs to make, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute.
We'll step through these grits going from 100 to 150 to 180 to 220. At 220, I start collecting my sawdust, and that's important. The sawdust is used to make a paste for a glue sawdust mix. Make sure you have plenty of sawdust. You might need a little extra. Take your time and mix it up. At the end of the day, you want a mixture that is pretty fluid, not quite as thick as cake icing. I have a small plastic tool to apply this with. If I use this on my finger, I can get some good pressure on it to make sure it goes into the crack. At the end of the day, this mixture of sawdust is of all three woods, so it should be pretty neutral if you see it in the crack. We'll go back to 220 grit and sand off all the excess. At the end of the day, you can't tell there was a repair made.
I've got a 3/32 inch radius bit in my handheld router right here to put a round over edge on this small board. This is my scrap piece, and I use it to test out how things go before I attack the big boards. Now, I'll probably use a larger radius bit on the bigger boards, but for this one, my smallest bit is appropriate.
At the end of the day, I stayed with 3/32 for all 3 boards. It was the best way to go. It's a good bit, but there's still mill marks. Make sure you sand it down. It's time to address the handholds, and we'll start with a mark in the center. We'll index the shaper plate on the edge of the cutting board and the center mark we just made. The handhold is half a routed slot, 3 inches long and 1 inch in diameter. This is a simple task for the shaper origin. It has these shapes built in. It's just a matter of programming in the basic dimensions and then cutting away the material. Not forget the feet. I've made a little jig that helps me place it right in the corner, and all I want to do is touch it. I will follow up after I've made the mark and drill it to depth.
All right, we're stepping back to 220 because of all the stuff done, and our holes are there, these are there, and we'll go ahead and give it a good sand. Well, we are sanded down to 400 grit, and these look great. I have put the feet on underneath it because I want to protect them. I don't want the bottom scuffed. We still have a couple more things to do, so this isn't the end of the episode. The end of the episode is right there. Well, we're getting down to brass tacks. It's time to start thinking about finish. And for a project like this, we're looking at butcher block oil. This is specially designed for in-grain butcher blocks, and it's food safe and it penetrates the wood deeply. We will apply a generous coat and then wipe off after about 15 minutes. At that point, it needs to sit 4 hours, and then we need to repeat the cycle for 2 more times after 4 hours of waiting. So it's a lengthy process. After that, we hit it with conditioner, and that conditioner is to help protect it, and we will continue to apply conditioner through the butcher block's life. Now, I have left the feet on the bottom, and the reason is this. I have to set it down on something, and if there's a contaminant on the bottom, I have had it pass through the oil into the wood, and I really don't want to see that happen at this point. So I'm going to leave the feet on. We'll go ahead and put the finish with the feet on, and that way the feet will protect the block from any other contaminants. Now, you've probably noticed this one has got a color change. I have put, early on, I put a coat of oil on this one. I wanted to see what it looked like, and I think it looks great. But the color change going from this to this was dramatic. So let me get the camera moved, and we'll get a shot so that you can share in the experience. Well, they are done, and they look great. I've got 3 coats of oil and 2 coats of conditioner, and the results are fantastic. These things are kitchen ready. I think the bride and groom are going to be very happy with their gift. They also mesmerize. I really like this 3D pattern. This is something I've wanted to do for a long time. Now, we did a whole lot more than just assemble a bunch of cutting boards. We built the jigs that facilitate this process. Keep in mind, Episode 1, the jig for the log, that's what has this 3D pattern along its length. That's where we get the pucks. We have to marry up 5 strips of wood and glue them up seamlessly. Otherwise, you can't pull off this pattern. In this episode, we built the compression ring. That's where you take the pucks, assemble them in a field, and have high uniform pressure in 2 directions in order to glue this up. That particular jig gives us a lot of flexibility with regards to the size of cutting board we build. Now, if you like what you've seen, give me one and subscribe. I could use a few more of you out there. What happens next week? Well, I'm not exactly sure. We have competing projects in the shop. I've got a kitchen renovation project where we've got a number of drawers that are going into existing cabinets, and the study needs to be finished out where we've got drawers, doors, trim packages, not to mention finish. There's a lot going on here in the shop, but whatever we do, I hope to see you next time in Roby's workshop.